Welcome to today's virtual panel, Non-Religion, Social Change, and Human Rights, hosted by the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project in partnership with the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa. Thank you again for joining us today. While we gather here virtually today, the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project is housed at the University of Ottawa, which sits on unceded Algonquin territory. Please join me as we pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We acknowledge traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. Thank you. I'd now like to introduce today's panelists. Laurie Beaman is the Canada Research Chair in Religious Diversity and Social Change, a professor in the Department of Classics and Religious Studies at the University of Ottawa, and the principal investigator of the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project. She previously directed the Religion and Diversity Project. Her current and engaged areas of research include non-religion, human-non-human relationships, equality, law, and religious diversity. Juan Marco Vaggione is full professor of sociology in the School of Law at the National University of Córdoba, a tenured researcher at the National Scientific and Technical Research Council in Argentina, and a co-investigator for the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project. Professor Vaggione is the current director of the Sexual and Reproductive Rights Program at the National University of Córdoba. His research interests include the analysis of sexual and reproductive rights in Latin America, the emergence and mutations of socio-political conservatism in Latin America, and the public roles of religion in democratic contexts. Last but not least, André Laliberté is a professor in the School of Political Studies at the University of Ottawa, where he teaches about identity politics, the politics of Asia in general, and China in particular. Professor Laliberté has published on religion and politics in China and Taiwan. He has presented his work as a visiting scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., as a research associate of the group Société, Religion et Laïcité in Paris, and the Center for Religions in Chinese Societies at Purdue University. He is a co-investigator on a SHRREC-funded project exploring ethnicity and democratic governance, and on a project examining conditions experienced by migrant care workers in Asia. Finally, he has been invited as a visiting researcher by an international team based in Leipzig, looking at secularity in the non-Western world. And with that, we will begin our panel, and I will hand things over to Laurie.
Good afternoon, morning, wherever, evening, everyone. I see so many familiar faces and names, and I'd really just to talk and just have a conversation about human rights and non-religion. We're going to try to do some of that. We're going to each take about 10 minutes, and Emma's going to cut us off if we go over. And then we're hoping that we can open up for questions and conversation. I wish we had longer, but we have only an hour, so I'll just start by wishing the Human Rights Research and Education Center a very happy 40th birthday. It's in their honor that we're doing this panel. This center is an important intellectual and policy hub based at the University of Ottawa. I always think about it as the little center that could, and does. It has a phenomenal repertoire of events, especially given a relatively limited budget, yet they have a very large international and national footprint. So I'm honored and proud to be associated with the center. So with the happy birthday said, let me just turn to the topic at hand. And I'll start by saying the religious composition of a country impacts the human rights issues that arise in it. Oftentimes, though, religion disappears in human rights discussions, except for very explicit mentions of religious freedom. I think it's important to consider the more subtle and often complex ways that religion and non-religion are part of the human rights story. I'm focusing primarily on Canada today, and my colleagues are focusing on China and Argentina, but we all work in a bit of an international way, so I'm sure we'll stray a little bit outside of that too. The human rights issues that arise in each of these contexts are certainly different, but we will, I think, find some similarities. And I'll turn to context again in a moment. But first, I'd just like to situate myself a little bit. I'm the principal investigator of the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project. There are quite a few of our team members here. So hello and greetings to all of you. The project identifies the social impact of the rapid and dramatic increase of non-religion. Canada is the focal point for our international research, but our sites include Australia, the Nordic countries. We sort of lumped the Nordic countries all in together, but we mean Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Finland. And I see Inger is here, for example, Inger Furseth from Norway. The United States, the United Kingdom, Brazil, and Argentina. The project has 5 focal areas: health, law, education, the environment, and migration. And in each of these areas, we ask how the approaches and interests of the non-religious challenge existing and taken for granted practices and cultures. In answering these questions, we will build an evidence base, and we are building an evidence base from which to identify models for living well together in complex, diverse, and inclusive societies. Of particular interest to me is the rise in non-religion and what impact that social change has on human rights issues. The category non-religious is complex. And I'll confess up front that we have resisted defining it. So if you ask us to define it, we'll continue to resist for the time being. But it does include a wide range of people, from atheists, humanists, the spiritual but not religious, agnostics, and those who are quite simply indifferent to religion. We can capture some of this with survey data. A Statistics Canada report released on October 28th of this year, drawing from data from the 2019 General Social Survey, found that affiliation with organized religion, participation in religious activities, and the importance of religious or spiritual beliefs in Canadian lives continues to decline. To give you a sense of the dynamic nature of religious affiliation, for example, in 1985, 90% of Canadians were affiliated with a religion compared to 68% in 2019. In 2003, 71% of people reported that their religious or spiritual beliefs were somewhat or very important, compared to 54% in 2019. If you think that formal or institutional religiosity is simply being replaced with at-home religious or spiritual activities, the data would not support you. Those who reported engaging in religious or spiritual activities on their own at least once a week fell from 46% in 2006 to 30% in 2019. For a nuanced discussion of the trends in religion in Canada, I suggest the book Leaving Christianity by Brian Clark and Stuart McDonald, as well as Joel Thiessen and Sarah Wilkins-Laflamme's None of the Above. And I see that Sarah is here as well today. The StatsCan data capture a social phenomenon that falls under the area of study sociologists are calling non-religion, irreligion, in some cases secular studies. As I've said, I'm interested in the social change related to religion and its impact. And for the purposes of this panel, I'll focus on human rights for the little wee bit of time that's left. It's widely accepted that the human rights protection of freedom of religion includes freedom from religion, something that has been emphasized by UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief, Ahmed Shahid. As the number of non-religious people increases, which it has been doing now for approximately 50 to 60 years in Canada, this aspect of religious freedom is becoming increasingly salient, freedom from religion. There are several points that I'd like to make about the intersection of non-religion and human rights. First, the issues that arise at the intersection of non-religion and human rights are country and context specific. That doesn't mean there aren't commonalities between countries, but that it is vital when thinking about the interface between non-religion and human rights that we consider the context carefully. Context-specific features include the traditionally dominant religion, constitutional and legal histories, the presence and role of Indigenous communities, and colonial histories. These histories shape what is constructed as religion and the power dynamics that accompany that. In Canada, the majoritarian religion has been and remains, in fact, Christianity, a combination of Protestantism and Catholicism, meaning that social institutions and public practices have been shaped by that history. The second point is that the impact of increasing non-religion and accelerated religious diversity, what I've called elsewhere the new diversity, is real in terms of human rights claims. The impact of religious diversity and diversity is real. One area that has especially intrigued me, and indeed I've written a book on it, is the controversy surrounding majoritarian religious symbols and practices. Those cases in which the non-religious and occasionally minority social and legal actors challenge symbols include the hanging of crucifixes on classroom walls, as was the case in Lautsi in Italy, which went to the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights, the 40-foot high cross in the median of a public thoroughfare in the American Legion case in 2019, the prayers in municipal council meetings in the town of Greece, New York, and our very own Canadian case, the Saguenay case, which involved prayers at municipal council meetings, as well as a crucifix and Sacred Heart statue in the council room. Majoritarian religion has responded to challenges to such practices and symbols by claiming that they are representative of our culture, our heritage, our history, and in many cases that they are not really religious, but symbols and practices that represent universal values and that they do not cause harm. There is little explicit acknowledgement that the our in our history, heritage, and culture is the traditional Christian majority, and that there are those, both non-religious and others, who are not included in this us and who do not consider themselves to be included in this us. The third point is that non-religion is impacting not only legal claims, but approaches to symbols and practices in day-to-day life, part and parcel of the question of what it means to live in an inclusive, diverse, and equal society. Those issues at the heart of human rights. The confluence of human rights culture and non-religion influenced, for example, the decision of the Saint-Sacrement Hospital to take down a crucifix that was hanging in its foyer. The hospital board referenced the Commission on Human Rights and Freedoms and the fact that hospitals are not places that people choose to come, and therefore the crucifix could be experienced by some as coercive. Fourth point I'd like to make is that the rise of non-religion also impacts interpretations of human rights guarantees in social institutions, from everything from prayers in schools to legal reasoning. When I was in 8th grade, for example, in a public school in New Brunswick, my homeroom teacher began each day with a reading from her Bible, which she kept on her desk, and then encouraged, shall I say, forced us to say the Lord's Prayer. Although we can't point to a causal relationship, surely the diversity shift in Canada has impacted, for example, the language we use to talk about assisted dying, from assisted suicide to medical assistance in dying. In research that Corey Steele and I have conducted, and on which he has written his MA thesis and is writing his doctoral thesis, we have observed that the goodness of suffering has been replaced with dignity. And in the Supreme Court of Canada Carter decision on MAID, the sanctity of life has been recrafted to mean that human life need not be preserved at a cost. The fifth point is that non-religion also impacts public policy and diplomatic traditions that in turn directly address human rights such as freedom of religion and conscience. I'll just mention quickly the case of Rahaf Mohammed Al-Kunin in January 2019, the 18-year-old woman from Saudi Arabia who made media headlines around the world when she holed herself up in a Bangkok hotel room and because of, she was fleeing, alleged abuse from her family in Saudi Arabia. And she was eventually accepted as a refugee in Canada. At the center of her story was her atheism, so her non-religion. I want to end by stating two things that are perhaps obvious, but I think incredibly important to remember. First, the characterization of social actors as religious or non-religious is not as easy as you might think. In our project on same-sex marriage, what is very much a human right, very much a human rights issue, the non-religion and a complex future team members have observed that so-called secular actors sometimes employ natural law arguments. For example, marriage is not created by law, but predates law, referencing a transcendent force. And we've seen this in Brazil and Canada, for example. In the same reference to same-sex marriage, the Attorney General of Alberta used such arguments. Secondly, we must be cautious about imputing support for or opposition to human rights based on religion or non-religion. In a project led by Doug Ezzi on religious freedom and LGBTQ plus employees, we found in a survey that the majority of Christians support LGBTQ plus equality, including a majority among Christians who attend church regularly. In Canada and in Australia, those who attend church regularly tend to be more conservative Christians. This suggests that the opposition to LGBTQ plus equality is mainly being driven by conservative lobby groups, and that these may not reflect the attitudes of the Christians they claim to represent. So the situation and picture is complex, related to religion, non-religion, and our ability to predict who may take which position vis-a-vis human rights. So social change related to non-religion is reflected in shifting claims and conceptualizations of human rights, which help us to frame, ultimately, the kind of society we want to live in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lori. We're now going to move to our next panelist, Juan Marco.
Thank you, Emma. Hello, everyone. Congratulations to the center for its birthday. Thank you for the invitation. Oh, probably I shouldn't thank anyone, because to put these three big concepts in 10-minute talk is giving me nightmares. So how to use my time to talk about non-religion, social change, human rights. If Lori doesn't want to define religion, non-religion, I have no idea how to do it. So I will follow Lori's idea not to define it. I was thinking that probably I would use my 10 minutes to think on the impact that feminist and LGBTQ movement had had on human rights, and also the way in which this impact has reshaped our understanding of religion, non-religion, as well as some reaction to the impact of those movements in human rights agenda. Of course, it's going to be a very telegraphic, hesitant kind of presentation, so my apologies in advance. Well, it's obvious to say that feminist and LGBTQ movement has created very crucial central social change worldwide, and particularly in Latin America. I mean, the world is not the same from a social, political, or cultural perspective if we understand the impact of this movement, but not only the impact in the way we inhabit the world, but also the impact in the way we analyze the world we live in. The impact has been both a political impact and, of course, an academic impact. And human rights as an agenda, of course, is not an exception to this impact. I mean, for feminist and LGBTQI movement, human rights has always been not only an arena, but also a strategy to move further for more egalitarian and democratic societies. And although it been mobilized for decades in order to change our understanding of human rights, one can locate the most crucial moment on the impact of this movement on human rights in the mid-90s, in the conference of El Cairo and Beijing, where finally reproductive rights first and sexual rights after that enter the human rights agenda. And of course, that was a very paradigmatic and important change in the way we define human rights in general. And of course, it was so paradigmatic that has generated very strong reactions against it, reactions that are still going on and reshaping. I mean, mid-90s was also the moment in which the Catholic Church, the hierarchy, the Vatican, began being much more aggressive on the debate on the appropriation of human rights agenda in order to redefine it according to values such as life, family, freedom. And this agenda of human rights from feminist LGBTQI movement was named as a sort of quote-unquote tragic denial of human rights by John Paul II in one of the encyclicals at the time. Latin America was not an exception to that. I mean, the way in which this movement has impacted the alliances and the agenda of human rights is undisputable. I mean, an agenda that for Latin America has been crucial because it was the agenda in order to resist authoritarian government, in order to push further more democratic stability, is now being defined by feminist and LGBTQ movement in order to include abortion legalization, same-sex marriage, sex education, gender identity laws. So there has been also a very important change in the way we speak, talk, and understand human rights as an agenda. And in doing so, I think it's important. To note the way in which feminist and LGBTQ movement began to talk about religion, and one can say also non-religion, in new ways. I mean, don't have the time to go further, but let me just give you a couple of examples. On the one hand, there was a strong going back to the issue of laicite from completely new understanding in order to push further sexual and reproductive rights in Latin America. There was a new definition of what laicite, what church state mean, what the impact of the Catholic Church in Latin American countries was supposed to be. But on the other hand, one can say there was a reinforcement in what can be said as a non-religious activism. For example, the apostasy campaign that began, that exists in several Latin American countries, was really helped and pushed further by feminists and LGBTQ movement. Hugo Rabia, Julia Martinez Ariños has shown us how closely related this campaign, this apostasy campaign, and feminist movement has become in their common agenda and mutual kind of articulations. So on the one hand, and this is a very important point, and I will quote Laurie and Tim Stacy introduction to their last book, sexuality is a determinant not only in the main change about the religious, non-religious imaginaries, but also in their politicization. So I think here we have a crucial way in which human rights become the arena for this kind of politicization. But also, and this is the second element of my presentation, sexuality and human rights become a crucial one for those conservative religious actors mobilizing with the complete opposite definition of what human rights are supposed to be. I don't have the time, but I only want to call your attention for the term that is very familiar in Latin America, many European countries, not as much in Europe or the US, that is this fight against gender ideology, the coin of this anti-gender campaign that is a way of referring to feminist LGBTQ movement and their demands. This concept of gender ideology was coined precisely at the moment in which feminists did advance their agenda at UN international conferences. And since then, although it was coined in pro-life activism in USA, since then it's part of political debates all over Latin America. It's appropriated by the Catholic hierarchy, by political parties on the right side. So the fight against gender ideology as an euphemism to sexual and reproductive rights is a crucial characteristic of the way in which human rights are being debated for conservative religious sector. Even the Pope Francis has called this sort of gender ideology part of the new coloniality, a colonialization ideology, aiming to really deny the importance and the universality of human rights. And one central element, I think, speak directly to this religious and non-religious dichotomy is the way in which freedom is being mobilized. I mean, Laurie spoke about religious freedom, but it's not only religious freedom that is being mobilized by conservative religious groups in the confrontation of gender ideology. It's freedom of consciousness that wasn't supposed to be only about religion, but it's also freedom of the parents, parental rights to decide how to educate their own children against this ideology that is called gender ideology. Because I'm close to my time, let me just finish by saying that there's no doubt that law in general and human rights in particular has become, following Karl Marx, have become an institutionalized site of power struggle where precisely what we understand by religion and non-religion is getting debated and contested. On the one hand, as I tried to show, feminist and LGBTQI movement has begun setting new frontiers in what count as religion and what count not as not religious. Began redebating what cultural heritage should be understood as Christian heritage. But on the other hand, also conservative religious activism has prioritized law as an arena in order to re-Christianize the public sphere, a sort of one can say secular evangelization process through the uses of law. So I think that it's in this between religion and non-religion that the main dynamics are taking place, and no doubt that human rights as an arena, as a strategy, is a crucial dimension to observe and to reflect on these debates. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Juan Marco. And lastly, we will turn to André.
I've prepared a PowerPoint presentation for this, but I don't know if you can see it. Okay, so it's quite a challenge, to be honest, to present on China because of the categories that you have both so brilliantly exposed are not really easily traveling in that part of the world. But at the same time, because this is a Human Rights Research and Education Center, and we are talking about the role of the nuns as both a category that is targeted by religious conservative, I think that in the case of China, we have to think of something quite different. And what I'm going to do might appear as being provocative, but I just want to reassure you, it's just presenting a really different and challenging reality. So I'm titling my presentation, Whether the Nuns Are in Power. What I want to emphasize is that when we talk about the religious in China, we have to rethink our categories very much. And even though China is the society with the largest numbers of nuns, this is quite misleading. And I will go fast for the first slides and concentrate on the last part of my presentation where I clarify this seeming paradox. Well, first, the hard facts that I assume that most of you are aware of is that the country is led by a political party that is having a monopoly and of power, and that is premised on a philosophy that is atheistic and therefore that would certainly count as a non-organization. Of course, you also know about the reality of the Uyghur genocide, the repression against Tibetan culture, and the persecution against house churches in China. So in other words, here we have a situation where something that is considered sociologically as belonging to the category of nuns is the oppressor in that society. But beyond these simple facts, there are some ambiguities that are really interesting. First of all, should we qualify the Communist Party as an organization that speaks for the nuns? It's more complicated than that. Then, of course, are the nuns more likely to escape persecution if we believe that, they are in power? And I will argue no, because, and that's going to be the core of my presentation, I will say something about who are the nuns in China. For example, if you look at these peoples that are here at a Buddhist temple, many of them would identify as Buddhists. Many of them would identify simply as tourists. Some other ones would identify simply as people who are following tradition. And if they would be asked in a survey, what is their religion? They would probably answer none. But that's the easiest part of the equation. The nuns, according to statistics in China, are considered the largest group in that country. And it's not only the self-declaration, of course, of the members of the Communist Party that they have to profess and they have to commit to being atheist to start with. But also, if you look at the official numbers in the surveys, if you look at the surveys that have been done in China in 2014, the last time such survey could be done, 25% of the population were described as religious believers. That is, they were either Buddhists, Taoists, Christians, or Muslim. That's it. That's what was included in the survey. Something that we think is unconceivable in North American or European societies, where you have many other options to choose from. However, if you use different methodologies, you arrive at a completely different picture. Then you realize that 80% of the population would admit to practice a religion. So people don't necessarily claiming they are religious believers, but they would say believe in karmic retribution. They would believe in life after death. They would believe in all sorts of concepts that we can attach to religion. And these numbers are inclusive of people who would be classified by sinologists, the experts on Chinese culture, that they practice folk or communal religions. But what I want to emphasize is that the Communist Party itself behave in a way that, to me, has some interesting similarities with a very, very intolerant religious institution. Because the Communist Party, what you have here is the state administration of religious affairs in China. So to say that CCP members count as none is a little bit of an oxymoron, because of course they are based on the materialist philosophy. However, historically, you look at the role of Mao in recent contemporary Chinese history, and many of the aspects of the devotion towards him, many aspects of the way his power was exercised, had a lot to do with religious devotion, if not fanaticism in many respects. But also the way that the Communist Party, through the state administration, is regulating religious affairs is really showing interesting continuities with the way that the Chinese state in imperial times was really itself a religious actor that had an authority in determining what was legitimate or not in religious affairs. And today, the Communist Party has simply increased that interventionism in the religious affairs of China, because the state administration of religious affairs is now not a government institution, but is now incorporated within a unit in the Communist Party known as the United Front Work Department. So in other words, the party itself is giving the authority, is acquiring the authority to determine what should be considered legitimate in terms of religious affairs. And here's the problem, or the source of the paradox, if you like. It's the liminality of the religious and the non-religious in Chinese society. So what you have here is one of many NGOs in China who have a very blurred identity. So that's an organization known as Ranai, which was a charity that was associated with a Buddhist temple. And so to make sense of the liminality of religion in Chinese society, we have to remind ourselves that beyond the 5 big religions that the government recognizes, there are illegal religions, so sectarian traditions, redemptive societies, and movements that are not appearing in statistics, and therefore they would correspond, narrowly speaking, as nones. But there's something else. I mean, at least the illegal religions, sectarian traditions, they would still be easily identified by sociologists of religions as organized, institutionalized religions. But the communal religions, the religions that really are more referring to lineage associations, the cults of city gods, don't have the immediately perceivable features of traditional religions. And then there's all of those practices that many of you have heard before, like geomancy, like feng shui, or divination, and many practices that even people who are relating to them don't see necessarily as religion. They will understand that this is tradition, this is nature, that's cosmic laws. So in other words, the word religion does not capture exactly what's happening for them. So we can start to get a sense of this paradox of the religious and the non by looking at the emic concepts in Chinese society. And keep in mind that even the term religion itself is basically referring to sectarian teaching. So Zongjiao is a compound of the 2 characters here at the end. And that's a sharing with education. So, which is the first character in the expression jiao yu. And that character, jiao, is a character that is used simply to the transmission of knowledge, so teaching. And there are other characters like the way, hui, society, and the family, jia. And when it is associated with a character for the Buddha or the way or the Lord of Heaven, then you have another way to describe a religious system. People within these social movements identified with these traditions might see themselves as part of a tradition, but not necessarily as part of a religion. So in other words, there's a very fuzzy line between the two. And then finally, I want to emphasize the fact that orthodoxy or the right way of thinking, zheng, is opposed to xie, which is heresy. So those categories, again, are not considered religion. They are considered traditional, they are considered historical, but they have important repercussion for people who follow the teaching of especially xie jiao, like the Falun Gong, for example, which is one of the most well-known example. And I will conclude by saying that, yeah, it's very difficult to determine the boundary of the nuns in China. And also it's very important to keep in mind that even if the nuns would appear to be in power, they are also, on the other hand, very often the target of discrimination because they don't fit with the official categories of what is the religious. So I'm told I have only 1 minute, so I just wanted to show the illustration of the nuns who are persecuted. So what you have here is simply a list of some of the best known religious movements. And again, that would not be considered by the state as legitimate religions, and that would be considered as superstition, as crazy beliefs, secret societies, and therefore all sorts of social categories that deny them the reality of religiosity. So superstition being another category, or false beliefs. So again, that's a wide range of issues to consider. So I will leave it at this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andre. And thank you so much to all our panelists. This concludes the panel presentations portion of this event. So a quick round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for your fascinating presentations. So we're now going to move to questions. I've actually already received a question in the chat, and so I will begin by asking that. And then please indicate in the chat if you would like to ask a question as well. Once again, if you prefer that I read it out loud, just let me know. So our first question, this is specifically for Lori, but the other panelists are welcome to chime in as well. And this is from David Seljak. So the question, as you know, the Ontario Human Rights Code protects against discrimination based on creed, that is, religion. OHRC policy demands accommodation of religious needs up to the point of undue hardship. However, this protection and right to accommodation does not extend to non-religious ethical positions, such as humanism and ethical veganism. This means, for example, that a person incarcerated in a Canadian prison could ask for a vegetarian diet on religious grounds and would have that accommodated. However, prison officials would not have to accommodate such a request based on a non-religious belief system, such as ethical veganism, even if it were existentially just as important as a faith-based belief system to the individual. Given that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees freedom of religion and conscience, do you see the evolution of the right to accommodation of creed to include non-religious beliefs?
Hi, David. Thank you for that. And David also sent me the question in chat, which was good because it's a long academic question, David. That's like typical academic format with lots there. And the short answer is yes, I do. I think that we're moving in that direction. And I like that Sarah says, oh, doesn't it extend to veganism? And yes, it is up for debate. But I think the freedom of conscience piece of this is going to come into greater play. And if you know the debates kind of going on around freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, and the work that, for example, Beth Hurd does, Winnie Sullivan is doing, taking on the idea that essentially arguing that religion is overplayed. Beth's work focuses on international relations and the overplay of the category religion. That she's not denying that religion exists, but she's saying, we need to be much more complicated in our thinking. And one of the things that I really like, André, thank you so much. I mean, what I really like is the counterpoint that you offer to what we're talking about, and really kind of pushing the boundaries and saying, okay, let's turn things on their head and let's think about this another way. And let's take another example, which is China, and all of the complicated ways in which religion, non-religion might be formulated in that context. And so I think that, again, David, the short answer, yes. I think we're moving in that direction. I think it was perhaps only possible because of the, I want to say decline in Christianity. That's just, I don't like saying it that way because I think Christianity is going to be around forever. But we're seeing a shift in power. And I think that's the way I'm wanting to think about it, is there's a shift in power. It's a shift from a majoritarian position to something else, a situation in which we're re-navigating, renegotiating, thinking about how do we live in a just, equal society, an inclusive society. And that means power relations are having to be renegotiated. So yes. David, the short answer is yes. And I kind of tried to pull in a whole bunch of other things there too.
Just quickly, André or Juan Marco, do you have anything to add? I just wanted to open that up in case you'd like to comment on this.
On the issue of the accommodation to vegetarian or vegans in jail, frankly, in the context of China, I would say it's, I don't know enough about the context of jails in China, except that the conditions for prisoners of conscience and people who are victims of abuse because of their religious belief or their political belief for that matter is just, I mean, it defies comparison, basically. I would decline even to compare with the Canadian situation. I know it's not polite to say, but I have to say it.
Thank you, André. I'd like to open the floor to further questions. Does anybody else have something that they would like to ask? Oh,
Yes.
Yes, Sarah, welcome to the plan. Go ahead.
All right, this is like a very quick question, but thank you everyone. Great presentations. It was just a quick follow-up to the vegan issue. Did they ever settle that that OHRC case with the vegan firefighter that made like a big splash in the media? I think it was around 2017. Did that ever come to some kind of conclusion, or is that just ongoing? No, just throwing that out there.
Lauren probably knows. I don't know if she's there. I think she is.
Okay, I'll ask Lauren.
She follows that case quite closely, I think.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think that's really like a fascinating new frontier of human rights and non-religion in Canada and other countries, is those kind of like substantive non-religious worldviews, and do they can they fit within this kind of human rights framework, right? I think that's where we'll find out in the next few years. Yeah, really, really fascinating.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Yeah, actually, if I may, you asked me about China, but I should say something about Taiwan, because Taiwan is also a society with a Chinese culture, and many of the religions that are practiced in China are also practiced in Taiwan. But the approach of Taiwanese society, down from the government to the believers and non-believers, is more comparable to Canada. So I really want to say this because I don't want to come across as someone who believe in cultural essentialism and saying that the attitude of the Chinese government, even if I made a parallel with the tradition of statehood, I don't want to say that there's something in Chinese culture that is totally unlikely to change and that will, make impossible to think in terms of acceptance of diversity. I really don't want to make that argument. And to me, Taiwan is very, very important, even if it's a small place. it's a crucial place because it demonstrates the invalidity of this culturalist argument.
Thank you, André. Yes, go ahead, Ravi.
I don't have a question so much as a comment, very briefly. So I was very interested to hear these presentations. I'll try to be as brief as possible. My work is on disability rights, which on the surface, well, I'm thinking about where these connections may lie. There's this suited set of human rights issues, and I taught human rights here at U Ottawa for a number of years. But I was struck at Laurie's presentation at the beginning, the reference to Carter, because many of us that work on disability issues, we work on Carter, we work with evangelical Christians in many cases, but we're secular. We're secular people, and we have arguments that are framed in disability rights. What I've noticed is a lot of people that come out of the humanist, rationalist, is they sort of assume that that the only arguments around euthanasia, and they conflate to abortion, but people are not fetuses, and they see them as the same thing. But in fact, there's this whole spectrum of views on, and there's not one disability committee, but many, many national disability organizations, none of which are officially Christian, have been opposed to euthanasia and don't see dignity in the same, that they see it as cost cutting and a lack of supports and lack of health care and all the dysfunctional things that come with neoliberalism. But I'm interested in sort of how these intersections work. So I don't really have a question, simply to say sort of my take on this, but I want to thank all these very strong, interesting presentations. Thank you.
Can I respond, Emma?
Yes, go ahead.
Thanks, Ravi, so much for being here, and thanks for that comment. And I think that's where the end bits that I added in were coming from, and that is to leap to conclusions or characterizations based only on the categories religion or non-religion is a mistake. That we can trace some arguments, we can trace some themes when we think about, and we see some social actors constructing themselves in particular ways vis-a-vis religion and non-religion, but that we need to go deeper than that, and that an analysis needs to be more complicated than simply those two categories. And so I appreciate your adding that in and adding it in from another perspective. So thanks again.
Probably just a short comment that is very obvious, but at least in Latin America, in Argentina in particular, when the abortion legalization debate took place, the role of disability organization became like a crucial kind of public voice, because it was really an important struggle among some organizations that were closer to the more conservative institution, trying to bring back the idea of abortion against disability. But on the other hand, they created like a new alliance between feminism and some disability organizations that really push further the public debate on the role of disability and in connection to the religion, non-religion divide. Sorry, it was just a short comment on that.
Thank you so much. I saw the CSRS had their hands up. Does anyone there still have a question? I just wanted to give you the opportunity if you do.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Thanks so much. Hi. So one of the things I appreciated about what André did in his talk is that he, drew attention to the ways in which religion is differently situated. And I think you also drawn attention to the complications in the category of the nuns. I'm wondering if in this thread of discussion, there's any analysis of the other category that we're using without poking at it very much, which is the human rights category itself. It is itself a fairly new invention. It's a useful invention, but it is nonetheless an invention which is itself, as we've seen from the questions, culturally and historically situated. And I'm wondering, I'm not sure there's a better alternative to that category, but I wonder if in this thread of discussion there's any conversation about that category, which is itself quite, in some sense, treated as a religious entity. It has a kind of a magical quality to it, treated as self-evidently the case that everybody has human rights, even though it's something we kind of invented and decided to live according to. And I wonder if there's been any reflection on that.
So is your question about a legal definition of another category besides religious believers and non-believers? Because yes.
No, I'm just wondering if human rights is it just obvious to everybody that human rights is the best way to be thinking about
I see.
dilemmas that they appear in the public arena or in the legal arena? I see Lauren's raised her hand over here.
Right.
The one thing that comes to mind with that is rights for nature as well, and contesting the anthropocentrism of this idea of just human rights. And I think that arises a little bit too in terms of non-religion and just thinking about different ways of being in the world and relating to non-human nature and animals, is that, yeah, the idea of just rights for humans and human rights does become challenged a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So Lauren has identified the kind of passive-aggressive subtext of my question, which was encouraging us to think, in some sense, beyond the human.
Yes. Well, I would argue that, for example, for Buddhists, it's beyond human rights. But again, I would be hesitant in generalizing from, all Buddhists in China, because they don't generally articulate arguments based on human rights. That's a very, very, I would say, contested even topic to discuss now. It was less so for the last 10 years. There was a dialogue, just agreeing on what it means when we talk about human rights. So if we're not even able now to talk about human rights, then it becomes even more difficult to speak about broader subject of rights. Understand you refer to the perspective of David Singer, right? And looking at rights for other sentient beings. So certainly in Buddhist philosophy, there's concern for sentient beings. But again, that would not be articulated with the language of rights. That would be simply be articulated around other terms like welfare, for example, harmony and coexistence and those kind of terms.
Yeah, I'll chime in if I can't see everyone, and I can't see if Juan Marco wants to speak. So Juan Marco, just tell me if you do, but I'll chime in. Paul and Lauren, thanks for that. And Lauren, I had started to write a paragraph in this as I was trying to think about my points on implications of non-religion. And I mean, as you know, one of the implications I think for the way we're headed is the opening of the possibility of imagining non-human animals and perhaps going further as equals. When I think about Lynn White's piece in the 60s, challenging essentially naming the damage that Christianity had done in terms of stewardship and hierarchies, and the reverberations ever since from that piece, but thinking about, okay, what are we seeing in terms of the ability to conceptualize non-human others, and then of course the regime of human rights. So to take that up, and then I'm also working with on a project that Cheryl Kirkham is doing on persons with albinism in Africa, and listening to Elvis Imafidon, who's a African philosopher, saying, how can we even talk about human rights when persons with albinism are not considered human? So we have a couple of different ends of the spectrum here, if you will, in thinking about challenging human rights and the ways in which human rights are imagined to apply to particular constituencies, and pushing on that a bit, as Elvis does really well, actually, in his work, saying, what exactly is it we're talking about, and who gets to tap into these things we call human rights, and who's excluded? I think those are really valuable questions, not quite going in the direction that Lauren was going quite a different direction, and asking who gets to decide who benefits, and who are the people who are excluded. So, Paul, I haven't given a lot of thought to your question in terms of the challenging of the notion of human rights, and is that the way to go? but I think it's a valuable question, and certainly there is quite a large literature on this, and thinking about what does it mean to talk about human rights and who decides who accesses those and when.
Thank you so much. Well, we're at time, so we should probably wrap up. I think just talking about how we define and use human rights is a great way to conclude a panel on non-religion, social change, and human rights. So thank you so much for coming today. Thank you, panelists, for this fascinating discussion. Thank you, attendees, for your wonderful questions. And yes, please take a moment in the chat if you're interested in attending more of the Human Rights Research and Education Center's events in celebration of their 40th anniversary. Viviana has just shared a link. If you're interested in attending further non-religion in a complex future events, I am just sharing a link right now. We have 2 upcoming virtual events this month. And if you're interested in being added to our mailing list, feel free to contact me via our website. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. Thank you.